My dad took them on a cruise without inviting me, so I let the balance expire quietly. It was the text I never expected to receive, a photo of my father smiling on a cruise ship deck. Arms around my brothers, no invitation, no explanation. Just the image of a family trip I wasn't part of, a moment frozen without me. I stared at that picture for hours, clutching my worn travel diary from my teenage years. The pages where I had poured my hopes and dreams, where I had written about trips we would take together. Now, those dreams felt like distant echoes. The pain wasn't loud, it was a slow burn. A quiet sinking realization that I was invisible in my own family. My father chose my brothers for memories while leaving me behind. They sailed away with my place at the table and never looked back. I felt a deep ache in my chest. The kind that settles in your bones. The betrayal wasn't just the cruise. It was the years of silent exclusion, the subtle messages that I was less important. That diary, once a symbol of hope and connection, now felt like a relic of a love that had quietly vanished. It was a reminder of everything I was denied. I flipped through the pages, reading old entries filled with anticipation, laughter, and plans that never came true. I had clung to those words like a lifeline. They took my childhood memories and left me with silence. I didn't cry, I didn't call, I didn't confront. I simply let the balance between us expire quietly, like a debt that was never repaid. For years I had given without expectation. Now I chose to give myself the space to heal without them. I closed the diary gently and placed it on the shelf. It was time to write a new chapter, one where I was seen, heard, and valued. That night, I made a decision. I would no longer be the forgotten daughter on the sidelines. I let go, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. I started to see that sometimes the loudest justice is silence and the strongest love is self-love. The cruise sailed without me, but my journey was just beginning. Growing up, I was always the quiet one in the family, the daughter who watched her brothers get all the attention. My dad had this way of making Jake and Matt feel like princes, while I was the shadow in the corner. Birthdays, vacations, even simple weekends were orchestrated around them. Mom tried to smooth things over, telling me, "Girls are different. Emily, your brothers just need more." But that difference felt like an excuse for neglect. I watched as Dad celebrated Jake's baseball games with loud cheers, but missed my school recitals without a word. Our family dinners were like plays where the roles were clearly assigned. Dad would grill the boys about sports and plans, but ask little about me. I learned to stay silent, knowing my stories wouldn't be heard or valued the same way. As kids, Jake and Matt got the toys, the gadgets, the camping trips. I got hand-me-downs and quiet words. I began to believe that my needs were less important, that love was something handed out unevenly. At holidays, the family photos were a painful reminder. Dad stood proudly with his sons, their smiles bright and eager. I was often pushed to the edges, cropped out of group shots or blurred in the background. My brothers took weekend trips with Dad, laughing and bonding in ways I was never invited to share. When I asked why, the answer was always vague: a boy's thing, or you'll understand when you're older. High school was no different. Jake's accomplishments were loudly praised, his successes celebrated at every opportunity. Mine were expected, almost invisible. I learned early that I had to make my own way without their recognition. Even college was overshadowed. Dad sent Jake money for fraternity events but left me to figure out my own tuition. I felt like an outsider in my own family, struggling to find my place. When Jake got engaged, the excitement was palpable. Family plans were made without me, decisions about celebrations and trips finalized behind closed doors. I wasn't asked, I wasn't included. That engagement led to the cruise, the trip that stole more than just a vacation. It stole the last hope I had for being part of something that felt like family. The travel diary I kept in my teenage years was a sacred space. I wrote about dreams of trips with Dad, of moments we'd share. Those dreams faded as reality excluded me. I realized then that their favoritism wasn't just unfair, it was a deliberate choice to keep me on the outside. I stopped trying to explain my pain to them. They had made it clear who mattered. The brothers were the sons who sailed away with Dad, while I was left navigating a sea of silence. In a family built on exclusion, I learned to sail on my own. The red flags were subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. I remember family dinners where Dad's eyes would light up when Jake talked about his latest adventures, but drift away when I tried to share my day. My words felt like background noise. Gifts were telling, Jake's birthdays were celebrated with expensive presents and big parties. Mine were marked with a card and a sigh. When I asked Mom once why, she said Jake is more outgoing, he needs the attention. Vacations became a battleground for inclusion. Trips were planned around my brother's schedules, with Dad eagerly booking flights for them while I was left to make my own plans or none at all. The family group chat buzzed with excitement about cruises and weekends away. I was added only to see photos after the fact, my face absent, cropped or blurred. It wasn't a mistake, it was intentional exclusion. When I questioned Mom, she brushed it off as boys being boys. Dad said little, his silence a form of agreement. I learned that my feelings didn't hold weight in their world. Even the smallest moments revealed the pattern. At family events, Dad stood by my brothers, laughing and toasting. I was on the sidelines, expected to watch and be grateful. Jake and Matt reinforced the divide, inviting me to nothing but asking for favors and money. Our relationships felt transactional, love with a price tag. I noticed how plans were made without me, how my absence was assumed, not questioned. Invitations never arrived, and when I brought it up, I was told I was too sensitive. Holiday cards featured my brothers prominently, while I was just a name in the message. Photos showed smiling faces except mine. Every slight, every omission, piled up like stones in my chest. I learned to carry the weight quietly, hiding the hurt. Friends asked if my family was normal. I smiled and nodded, too ashamed to admit the truth. The cruise was the final proof of my exclusion, a lavish celebration of love without me, my name missing from every list. I realized then that the red flags weren't warnings, they were walls. Built to keep me out. They weren't just ignoring me, they were erasing me. The betrayal wasn't whispered or hidden, it was on full display. When the family group chat lit up with photos from the cruise, I felt my world crumble. There was Dad, Jake, and Matt smiling under a golden sunset, wrapped in memories I was never allowed to make. My absence was glaring. I scrolled through every image, desperate for any sign of me. But there was nothing, not a glimpse, not a shadow, not a memory I belonged to. It felt like I had been erased from a story I had lived, but was never part of. In one close-up, Jake wore a silver bracelet that stopped my breath. It was the same delicate charm my father had gifted me years ago, a symbol of a bond now worn by the brother who sailed away without me. They stole my place in the sun and left me in darkness. The sting of that moment cut deep. This wasn't oversight or accident. It was a deliberate, silent broadcast of my exclusion and their favoritism. The group chat buzzed with laughter and plans for the next adventure. My silence was the only reply I had. I was the ghost in their pictures, the forgotten daughter. I clutched my travel diary, its worn pages filled with dreams and hopes I had once nurtured. Now, those dreams felt like scars. Reminders of love given and withdrawn. They invited my brothers to a journey of a lifetime and left me behind with memories unshared. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I closed the diary with quiet resolve, deciding that this story wasn't theirs to write anymore. Humiliation isn't always loud, sometimes it's the cold weight of being overlooked while expected to remain grateful. That night, I made a vow to let the balance between us quietly expire. No confrontation, no drama, just silence filled with purpose. I realized that healing wouldn't come from their acknowledgement, but from my own strength. I remembered every time I tried to be seen and every time I was dismissed. The quiet wounds they left would no longer define me. I placed the diary on the shelf, not as a tombstone, but as a foundation for new chapters. They sailed without me, but I was charting my own course. The betrayal was deep, but my resolve was deeper. The days after the cruise photos arrived felt like drowning in silence. I woke each morning with a heavy weight in my chest, the ache of exclusion settling deeper with every breath. The family I thought I belonged to had moved on without me, leaving me stranded in shadows. At work, my focus shattered. Meetings blurred as my mind replayed those sunlit smiles and laughter I was never part of. Concentrating became impossible when grief and anger churned inside, fighting for space in my thoughts. Friends reached out with concern, but I shut the door. How could I explain the pain of being erased? How do you tell people your family billed you for a honeymoon you never attended? The loneliness became suffocating. I wasn't just left out, I was erased. Nights were the hardest. I sat clutching the velvet box that held my silver bracelet, the only tangible link to a childhood I once cherished. Tears slipped silently, mingling sorrow with a quiet fury I didn't know I had. I questioned myself endlessly. Was I too sensitive? Was I imagining the neglect? But the signs were clear in missed invitations, cold messages, and the deafening silence where love should have been. Therapy became a lifeline. I learned their neglect reflected their flaws, not my worth. That revelation was both liberating and painful, a paradox of healing. Journaling stopped. Words deserted me as silence became both my refuge and my prison. I withdrew, wrapping myself in solitude. Afraid to face the judgment I felt waiting at family gatherings, the thought of seeing their indifferent faces sent shivers down my spine. I avoided every event, isolating myself further, caught in a cycle of pain and invisibility. One night, I wrote a letter I never sent. It poured out raw emotion, betrayal, grief, and flickers of hope. Reading it aloud was cathartic, a moment of reclaiming my voice in a world that tried to silence me. Sometimes, hitting rock bottom is the first step to rising. I realized I couldn't wait any longer for their validation. I needed to find my own path out of the darkness. The silence that once suffocated me became the soil where my resilience grew. I planted seeds of strength in that quiet space. I began to dream of a life beyond their neglect, a life where I was seen, valued, and loved on my own terms. Each breath became a step forward. Each tear a release of what no longer served me. And in that collapse, I found the first spark of rebirth. The first day I dared to write again, I sat with trembling hands, opening a fresh notebook. For years, I'd hidden my pain in silent corners. Now, I poured it out, raw, unfiltered, and finally free. Each word was a step toward reclaiming the self they tried to erase. I wrote about the exclusion, the betrayal, the loneliness, not to blame, but to understand, to make peace with a past that haunted me. Writing became my refuge, a place where my voice was heard without judgment. For the first time, my voice belonged solely to me. Sharing parts of my story with trusted friends was terrifying yet healing. Their tears and nods told me I wasn't alone. Many had felt the same pain, invisible to their own families but seen by those who truly cared. Therapy helped me unpack the layers of hurt. I learned that their rejection was about their flaws, not mine. It was a lesson in self-worth no one else could teach me. I set boundaries. I stopped answering calls when respect wasn't there. I refused to be a silent bank for a family that didn't value me. Saying no became an act of courage. The silver bracelet, once a symbol of exclusion, became my talisman of strength. Wearing it daily reminded me of my resilience and growth. They tried to erase me, but I wrote myself back into existence. I booked a solo trip, a gift to myself, traveling alone. I discovered strengths I never knew I had, courage to face the unknown, freedom to explore, peace in solitude. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones who saw me, heard me, and celebrated me. Their presence was balm to a wounded soul. I shared my journey online, not seeking sympathy, but offering hope to others trapped in silence. Messages flooded in, stories of similar pain and triumph. Mom called once, her voice tinged with false concern. I chose not to answer. Healing was my priority, not appeasing their guilt. I smiled more, laughed louder, allowed myself joy without guilt or apology. I stopped waiting for their love and started fiercely loving myself. The past still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I was reclaiming my life, one word, one step, one breath at a time. I didn't send angry texts or dramatic messages. I didn't post bitter words on social media. Instead, I chose silence, the kind that speaks louder than any argument. I stopped answering calls, messages, and invitations. The silence was my shield, my refusal to be the invisible daughter who pays and stays quiet. When Jake and Matt posted photos of family events, I didn't comment or react. I let their words and pictures float in the void. That absence unsettled them more than any confrontation could. I was no longer background noise. I was a void they couldn't fill. They expected obedience. I gave them absence. The silver bracelet stayed on my wrist every day, a quiet reminder of a childhood stolen but not forgotten. Wearing it felt like reclaiming my own history, not the one they tried to rewrite. I published a collection of essays, raw, honest stories about family, betrayal, and self-worth. Names were changed, but the truth was clear. It wasn't revenge, it was recognition. At my book launch, I read a passage about being erased but choosing to exist anyway. The room was silent except for soft tears and quiet applause. I stood steady, no need for approval, just presence. Dad sent a text, proud of you. I didn't reply, yours too late. And empty words mean nothing. Mom called, desperate to mend bridges. I didn't answer. This was my boundary, firm and unyielding. I wasn't their background music anymore. I was my own soundtrack. I sent a copy of my book to their house, unmarked. With a single note inside, "You gave me silence, I gave you a voice." The last gift they would ever receive from me. That night, I locked the door behind me and felt lighter than ever. The past was there, but it no longer owned me. I was free. Months passed, and the silence between us grew, but this time, it was my peace, not pain. I started living for myself, embracing moments that brought me joy. Morning coffee rituals, evening walks. Deep conversations with friends who saw me fully. These small pleasures stitched together the fabric of a new life, one where I was no longer invisible. The silver bracelet I once hid away became a daily reminder of resilience. Polished and shining, it symbolized the journey from neglect to self-acceptance. Wearing it felt like reclaiming the story I was always meant to write. I booked my first solo trip, a gift to myself. Traveling alone, I discovered strengths I never knew I had: courage to face the unknown, freedom to explore, and peace in solitude. It was a turning point, an act of self-love. I shared my story publicly, not for sympathy, but for power. Through essays and social media, I connected with women who had endured similar pain. Their stories of survival fueled my own healing, reminding me I wasn't alone. Mom and Dad reached out a few times, their voices tentative, filled with regret. I chose not to respond. Protecting my peace was more important than reopening wounds. Healing required boundaries, and I stood firm. I immersed myself in work, friendships, and passions that nurtured my soul. The pain lingered but no longer controlled me. It was a shadow I acknowledged without fear. They cropped me out of their lives, but I framed my own. One evening, sitting by the window, I held the velvet box containing the bracelet. I smiled, knowing this was more than jewelry. It was a testament to my survival and growth. I decided to gift the bracelet to a friend who had been my anchor. I enclosed a note: "Carry this as a reminder that even in absence, we find strength." It was a passing of the torch, a symbol of hope. The past no longer defined my worth or dictated my future. I was the author of my own story, free to write new chapters on my terms. I walked away from the shadows of favoritism and into the light of self-love and acceptance, no longer seeking validation. I found peace within. The pain they caused became fuel for my resilience, the silence a canvas for my voice. They didn't invite me to the wedding, but I invited myself to a life of freedom. And that made all the difference.